Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Hilf Herr Jesu, Lass gelingen, which translates to Help us, O Lord, behold, we enter. This is a pretty straightforward chorale. Honestly, not too many interesting harmonic quirks. It's very plain, it's very simple, it's actually pretty delightful to listen to, and it was very delightful to analyze as well because of the fact that it's kind of refreshing in the midst of all of these chorales that have been very harmonically dense with their unique and very active profiles. So we're going to breeze right through this one. Starting off with one flat in the key signature, we start on F, we end on F. I reckon we're in the key of F major here, passing tone in the bass. And then we have A, C, F, and A, which is another F major chord in first inversion, so we'll just change the figure bass to reflect that. And Bach goes right back to root position on beat 3, so no need to reanalyze. Again, we'll just change the figure bass. Our first cadence is a half cadence in the key of B flat, though, so we will get a modulation to the key of B flat at some point, probably before this E flat here. Next measure, C, C, F, and G. This F is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, but when we take a look at the E on the next beat, we know that this chord is going to be C major, so that's a 5 chord in the key of F major. We have this delayed passing 7th as well in the tenor before we get D, A, F, and F. A deceptive progression, that's D minor, 5 going to 6 is deceptive. We then get G minor, G, B flat, D, and B flat, which is a 2 chord. 6 going to 2 is a good sign. It's a normative progression. 6 typically goes to 2. It's one of the most likely destinations for a 6 chord to go in this context. And I think this is where Bach is going to the key of B flat. We have a chromatic tone after this, and G minor is a common chord between the key of F major, where it's 2, and B flat, where it's 6. So we have a 6 chord going to 2, but then 2 is being recontextualized as 6. We have another passing 7th, or we have another passing tone in the bass. This time it's a passing 7th, and then we have E flat, B flat, G, and C, which is C minor 7 over E flat, again 6 going to 2, this time it's 2, 6, 5, C minor 7 over E flat, and we would expect that to go to some type of 5 chord as we're preparing for our cadence. F, A, F, and C. F major is no longer our tonic, it's our 5 chord because we're in the key of B flat. This B flat's a non-chord tone, this C is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. This D is a non-chord tone, and this E flat is a 7th, but it's not a chord tone the way that I have this chord analyzed. We then have B flat, C, F, and D. I reckon that what's happening here is this C is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, and our tonic is being implied, but this C is creating some interesting counterpoint because by the time we get the resolution on the next beat, the bass changes, and it doesn't change the structure of the chord functionally because it's still a 1 chord, but the bass still changes. So we can have this passing tone here in the bass, and then we have D, B flat, F, and D, which is just taking the chord and putting it in first inversion, just like we saw in the first measure of this phrase. This A is a neighboring 7th, and then we get B flat, F, and D, which is just taking the chord, and just like the first phrase, we're taking our chord and putting it back into root position. We're going to see this as a motive throughout the chorale, or at least in one more place, maybe 2, if my memory serves me correctly in this case. But we have 1-6 going to 5-3, or root position, before we cadence on F major, F, A, F, and C. And a quick note about this cadence as far as the way that it sounds. It did sound to me at first like this cadence had some plagal cadence vibes. If we treated this B flat like 4 in the key of F, and we treated this F as our tonic in the key of F, it does kind of sound like a plagal cadence. I had to listen to it a couple of times, and then eventually these E flats caught on, and then I started hearing it more like a half cadence. But I think ultimately there might be a little bit more to this argument regarding this cadence's identity, because if this were a plagal cadence, it would be unusual because the fifth of the chord is in the melody. I haven't looked at plagal cadences enough to know whether or not the fifth of the chord in the melody is particularly unusual, but it's very common in half cadences for the fifth of the chord to be in the melody. But we do have an imperfect authentic cadence later in the chorale that has a fifth of the chord in the melody as well, so maybe there's some type of symmetry going on. Phrase 1 ends with a kind of tonic functioning chord with a fifth of the chord in the melody, and then a definitely tonic functioning chord here with a fifth in the melody. So maybe this is a plagal cadence, and these E flats here might be implying some type of F mixolydian depending on how you hear it, but ultimately I do think B flat is what's going on here. I think that's the more likely analysis, and Bach is just sort of playing with the sounds here. Moving ahead, we do move back to the key of F major at some point because we do get a half cadence in the key of F major at the end here, but I don't think we really have any reason to modulate or expect a modulation until this E natural here. However, you know, B flat and F, they have many chords in common with one another. You could analyze this entire phrase in the key of F if you heard it that way, but I don't really have any reason to expect to have heard it that way, just because we're expecting some type of resolution from this 5 chord, and there isn't any juxtaposition of unlike accidentals or anything like Bach does sometimes. But moving on to the next phrase, we start things off with D minor, D, F, A, and D, which is a 3 chord in the key of B flat. Another sort of deceptive cadence. We saw 5 go to 6 here, now we're seeing 5 go to 3. It's kind of the other side of the deceptive cadence. But then we get G, D, G, and B flat. That is G minor in root position. That's our 6 chord in the key of B flat, and this is a good sign. 3 wants to go to 6, so that's good. And I think for the same reason that G minor was our gateway to the key of B flat, Bach is using it as our gateway back to the key of F major. It's always cool when he does that. Then we have an F here, which is a passing 7th. I think the harmonic rhythm is on beats 1 and 2 here, and I'm treating this like a passing tone because it doesn't really feel like a chord progression is happening here, like 2 to 2, 4, 2, for example. You could analyze it that way if you feel like the harmonic rhythm is staying consistent with the rest of the chorale, but I honestly don't hear it that way, so I'm just going to call it a passing tone. You could call it a chord if you want to. We then get E, C, G, and C. That's C major over E. That's 5, 6. Passing 7th in the tenor before we get F, A, F, and C. That's our tonic triad in root position. F major, another passing 7th, this time in the bass, before we get D, A, F, and F. That's a 6 chord, D minor, root position. Another passing, or sorry, this is a neighboring 7th in the bass here. So lots of 7th action in the bass. 1 going to 6, probably the most common third space progression, and it typically happens in a descending fashion as well. 1 going to 6. We then have D, D, F, and B flat. That is B flat major over D, which is 4, 6. Then we have 3 non-chord tones, 2 anticipations in the inner voices, and a passing tone in the bass. That leaves us with E natural, C, G, and B flat. That's C7 over E, or 5, 6, 5. So 4 going to 5, 6, 5. Typically when we have a 4, 6 chord in this ascending configuration here, where we have a 1 chord on the other side here, F, C, G, and A. Getting a little ahead of myself here, but this G is a 9/8 suspension over the bass, but we're still going to see this as a 1 chord in the analysis. When we have 4, 6 going to 1 via this ascending pattern, we always bare minimum have this leading tone connecting the 2 chords together, always. I don't think there has ever been a single case in all of the chorales up until this point where Bach has had this ascending third between the 6th of the scale, which is the bass of this 4 chord, and the root or the tonic of the scale, which is the root of this 1 chord. There's always the leading tone of the scale connecting, and sometimes Bach fully voices a chord. Most of the time it's a 7 chord though, but sometimes we see it voiced as a 5 chord, like we do in this case. But skipping this 1 chord here, we see its resolution on the next beat, F, C, F, and A, before we cadence on C major, C, C, E, and G, which is our 5 chord in the key of F major. So our A section consists of 2 half cadences. Pretty cool. Kind of an interesting form so far. But looking ahead to the B section, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D minor. So we're looking for a point on which we modulate to the key of D minor. I don't think we modulate until about halfway into the phrase, similar to our first phrase here where we have a key for the first couple of measures, and actually metrically we modulate in and around the same place, I think before this C sharp. But again, the idea with modulation zones is that modulations can happen so long as the chords are, I guess, diatonic to one another, right? Or they're diatonic to the keys that are being switched between. But continuing in the key of F major, we have C, C, G, and E, which is our 5 chord. Again, this is more of a style thing for me, but if we have the same Roman numeral over the span of 2 systems, I'll reiterate it. Unlike this right here where we have 2 1 chords, I will not reanalyze the 1 chord until we see a change in the chord. But when we change the system, it's more of a, what's the word? Convenience, a courtesy. It's a courtesy to someone who's following the analysis to do this. At least that's the way that I look at it. That's the way that I prefer to do it. If you don't do that and you're just keeping this for your own notes, that's totally fine that you skip it. It's more of just a style thing for me, but whenever it comes up, I do like to mention it. Passing tone in the bass, neighbor tone in the alto before we get E, C, G, and C. It's a first inversion C major chord, so very similar to the first phrase, we're seeing a triad inverted and then re-inverted back to root position on the third beat, C, E, G, and C. So hearing the phrase this way almost made me feel like we were in the key of C major for a second, but because we get the resolution to F afterwards, I don't think that's what's happening. F, C, G, and A. This 9/8 suspension over the bass has become kind of a motive as well. We've seen it a couple of times in the chorale so far with this F major chord with the G here being held over to the next beat. Neighboring 7th here in the bass before we get F, C, F, and A. Another F major chord, no need to reanalyze. And then we get B flat major, B flat, F, and D, which is a 4 chord in root position in the key of F. And coincidentally, it's also where I believe we are moving to the key of D minor. It's our 6 chord. Notice how we went to B flat over the 6 chord as well. I feel like that's not just a coincidence. I feel like it's a little too similar formally to look at it as a coincidence. So it's pretty neat. Afterwards, though, we get E, B flat, G, and C sharp. This is C sharp fully diminished 7th over E, which is 7, 6, 5. 6 going to 7. It's a fairly typical progression in Bach 6 operating as a predominant chord, and we would expect D minor on the other side of it, which we get F, A, and D, which is D minor in first inversion, 1, 6. And then we get D, D, B flat, and D, which is kind of an interesting chord, 2 roots and 2/3. I suppose this is actually 3 Ds and 1 B flat. So what exactly is going on here? Well, we could make the argument that this is a 6/6 chord, which is the way that I have it analyzed in my notes, with passing tones and just filigree going on here, just like how we get it here in the first phrase. This E flat is a non-chord tone. This F would be a chord tone though. However, I think there's an argument to be made here that maybe we have D minor in root position. And the reason why I say that is because if we look at the, oh, you know what? Scratch that. Never mind. This is just my problem with reading. I'm not the strongest reader. I had a hard time learning to read staff music, and it still catches up with me every once in a while. But this is I read this as an A for some reason. This is a C. This would be like a D minor 7 chord if we took one of the possible aggregates of the notes that occur over the span of this beat. But no, I think this is some interestingly spelled B flat major chord, and I think this is further justified by the chord on the other side of it. We have E, G, B flat, B flat and D, which is E minor 7 flat 5 over D, which is an interesting 2/4-2 chord. I think we saw a 2/4-2 chord recently, maybe even in yesterday's chorale. The exact chord progression is kind of escaping me, but 6-6 going to 2-4-2. 6 typically wants to go to 2, but the fact that they are sharing a bass here is particularly interesting. Regardless, the 2-4-2 chord does resolve the way we would expect after this neighbor tone in the alto. We have C sharp, A, G, and E, which is A7 over C sharp. That's 5-6-5. The bass does resolve down by step. That's how 2-4-2 chords want to resolve. This G is a chord tone. It's a neighbor tone, but it's a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And this B natural is just emphasizing melodic minor here. It's interesting that Bach is doing melodic minor on the way down. I suppose it's because he's trying to avoid the augmented second, which is not a typical interval that we get. It's a very, like a hefty interval in the context of music of this time period. Kind of an exotic interval. I imagine that that's the way that they looked at it, because it's just not an interval that you get naturally in the diatonic scales. So that's kind of the way that they treated it. Now it's a relatively common interval. But afterwards, after this 5-6-5 chord, we get it again, C sharp, A, G, and E. This E is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get D minor, D, A, F, and A, which is this tonic triad that has the fifth of the chord in the melody, similar to why I felt like this kind of sounded like a plagal cadence when you see sort of the symmetry between how the chords are spelled. They're both chords that have a fifth of the chord in the melody, and this just, I don't know, it sounds like a plagal cadence to me, but the more that you listen to it, the more that you, especially when you've convinced yourself that it has to be a half cadence, because that's what it looks like on the page, and that's what really makes sense analytically, you then kind of, I guess, sort of nudge yourself in that direction, then you convince yourself that that's what it sounds like. But looking ahead, we're eventually going to move back to the key of F major. We get a perfect authentic cadence in the key of F major, and similarly to the second phrase in the A section, we modulate in a similar, actually the exact same metric position on beat 2. But yeah, there's really no reason to rush to the modulation, because the keys are relative to one another, so they share more or less every chord in common until you start to factor in the leading tone between the two keys. But after our D minor chord, we get B flat, F, and D. This is a 6 chord. Lots of 6 chords in this chorale. B flat major, passing 7th in the bass, and then we get G minor, G, B flat, G, or sorry, not G minor, apologies, E diminished over G, G, B flat, G, and E natural. That's a 2 chord. Again, 6 going to 2. It's a good sign. We have another cycle of falling fifths progression to start off the second phrase in the pair. That's another sort of element of symmetry between the two chords. I think that's very interesting as well. But this is what I believe to be our gateway between the two keys. I suppose you could, this is another modulation zone, as I've been calling it, where you could really start the analysis in the key of F major at any point beyond or before this, because the keys are so similar to one another. But I do think this is being recontextualized in the key of F major as 7-6. E diminished is the leading tone to F as well. This G is a chord tone as well, so we don't need to mark it. We've seen this skipping down chord tone figure a couple of times, just like we saw here in the cadence. Oh no, never mind, that's me reading incorrectly again as well, but we saw this same figure here, which means that we're not getting like a passing 7th or anything, which is typically what we would expect. But regardless, 7-6 goes to 1, F, C, A, and F, tonic triad, F major. Then we get E, C, G, and G. This is C major over E, which is 5-6. Neighbor tone in the bass as well as the alto before we get E, C, G, and C again. That's another C major chord in first inversion, so we don't need to mark it. And then we get C, G, E, and B flat, which is taking the chord, putting it in root position, and adding that 7th. So this is a C7 chord in root position, so we'll just change the figure bass to reflect that. We then have F major, which is where we would expect it to go. F, F, C, and A. It's our tonic triad. And then we get B flat, F, B flat, and D, which is our 4 chord B flat major. And we get it again, B flat, D, F, and B flat. Lots of repetitious chords that are just re-spelled. It does create a sense of progression within the chord itself, because we're getting new notes in each of the voices, but the chord progression functionally doesn't change. So that's interesting when Bach does that. But then again, whenever you get chorales that are in 3/4, they always have a very sort of lilty, lofty feel, because Bach often plays with the harmonic rhythm, unlike the consistent harmonic rhythm we see in common time. At least that's been my experience with triple meter chorales. But afterwards we have C, G, F, and G. Again, another one of these 4/3 suspensions over the C major chord. This is of course implying 5. This B flat is a neighboring 7th before we get C, C, E, and G. That's the resolution to the chord on the previous beat. Another neighbor tone. And on beat 3 we get C, B flat, E, and G. That's just taking the chord, adding a 7th to it. It's still in root position. And then we cadence on F major, F, A, C, and F. Tonic triad in root position, and that is the analysis for this evening. This is a relatively straightforward chorale. Not too much to comment on. I think this first cadence is probably the most interesting bit for me, because to me it sounded like F mixolydian and we ended on some type of plagal cadence, but it makes more sense that it's a half cadence. It's 6 of one, half dozen of another, with a little bit more, I guess, to use the word heft again, to claim that this is modal would, I think, be a bolder statement than to say that we're ending just on a half cadence and this E flat is some type of like secondary predominant chord or something. But I think it makes more sense that we're in the key of B flat. Other than that, everything's very straightforward. Very quaint chorale, very easy to analyze, straightforward, like I said. But if you are interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon as well to be notified of when my daily upload goes live, and also hit the like button if you liked the content and helps my video or just my channel in general get seen by more people. We can grow the community to include more people who like Bach, who like analysis, and or maybe just looking into getting into the realm of Western music theory. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching this video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.